In June of 1854, inside a grand ballroom in Charleston, South Carolina, something happened that should not have been possible. Over 200 of the most powerful white men and women in the American South stood frozen in silence, staring at a painting they could not explain. The chandeliers burned bright above their heads. French champagne trembled in crystal glasses. And at the front of the room, where a celebration was meant to crown a young white prodigy, a black boy's name stared back at them from the canvas. Not whispered, not hidden, painted boldly in oil. Gideon. He was only 17. He was enslaved. He had never been trained, never taught, never allowed to sign his own work. Yet the painting before them showed mastery that rivaled Leonardo da Vinci himself. Light, shadow, anatomy, emotion. Something no slave was supposed to possess. By sunrise, newspapers across the South would call it a scandal. By the end of the week, powerful men would begin burying records. And by the end of the year, one boy would vanish, while his art refused to disappear. What they did not know was that this moment had been planned for years. And what terrified them most was that the truth could no longer be erased. Before we uncover what really happened, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and write the city and country you're listening from. Your presence keeps these stories alive instead of forgotten. Now let me take you back to where it all began. In the heavy summer heat of Charleston, South Carolina, the kind that clung to skin like wet linen and made even candle flames look tired, the city dressed itself for celebration. Carriages rolled down Meeting Street in a steady procession, iron wheels clicking over the stones, lanterns swaying on hooks like small moons. The Planters Hotel, tall, proud, and gleaming with fresh paint, stood lit from the inside as if it had swallowed a sunrise. Music floated out through open windows, a polished piano, violins, laughter too loud, too confident. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was sweet with perfume and sweat and expensive tobacco. Chandeliers hung above the guests like jeweled traps, catching the light and scattering it across silk sleeves and polished shoes. Over 200 people had gathered there, planters, judges, merchants, politicians, and their wives, every name that mattered in the coastal South, every family that believed the world was built to hold them up. They had come to praise a young man. Thomas Ashworth stood near the front of the room, where a velvet curtain covered a massive painting on an easel. He wore a tailored suit the color of dark wine. His hair lay perfectly combed, his face flushed with triumph. He accepted compliments as if they were his birthright. Genius, a woman whispered behind a fan. Prodigy, a judge said, smiling like he had discovered Thomas himself. Thomas's smile did not reach his eyes. Not fully. He drank champagne slowly, as though he needed the bubbles to keep something bitter from rising. Near the podium, Governor James Hopkins adjusted his cuffs and glanced at the clock. 8 o'clock precisely. The ceremony had been timed like a prayer. A performance for history. A moment for the newspapers. What none of them noticed, what none of them were trained to notice, were the small things that whispered of danger. The hotel staff moved with an unusual precision. A server carried champagne too carefully, eyes always scanning. A doorman lingered longer than necessary near the side exit. And in the shadowed corridor outside the ballroom, the faint scrape of something heavy against wood sounded once, then stopped. Inside, the governor began his speech. He spoke about culture, about refinement, about how the South was not merely strong in agriculture and commerce, but capable of producing beauty. Our civilization, he declared, voice rich and confident, is built on order, faith, and legacy. The room murmured approval. Men nodded like they were being praised personally. The governor gestured toward the covered painting. Tonight, we honor a son of South Carolina. A young man whose brush has captured not just likeness, but soul. Thomas bowed his head politely, the way a trained son bowed, the way a man bowed when applause was inevitable. Mr. Ashworth, the governor said, has painted a masterpiece commissioned for this very evening. A tribute to our founding, to our destiny. The words hung in the air like incense, and for a moment the ballroom felt like a church. Then Governor Hopkins turned, took hold of the cord beside the curtain, and pulled. The velvet fell away. At first no one made a sound. Not a gasp. Not a whisper. Not even the little nervous laughter that often followed something unexpected. Silence hit the room the way a door slamming shut hits a hallway. Sudden, absolute, and impossible to ignore. The painting that stood revealed was not a bright celebration of Charleston's founding. It was a portrait. A young black boy stared out from the canvas with eyes that seemed to contain weather. His face was painted with such precision that the guests could feel the texture of his skin, the softness of youth, the tension in his jaw. Light fell across his cheekbone in a way that made the room's chandeliers seem cheap by comparison. In his hand he held a paintbrush like a weapon. Behind him, faint in the background, was fire, orange and violent, rising from the silhouette of a plantation house. And scattered through the smoke were faces. Dozens of them. Some half hidden. Some clear enough to make the viewer feel watched. Old women. Men with scars. Children. Eyes turned toward the viewer like accusations. In the corner of the canvas, bold as a confession, was a single signature. Gideon. It took 3 heartbeats for the room to breathe again. Then the sound came back all at once. A woman screamed and dropped her glass. It shattered against the floor like a gunshot. Men began speaking over each other, voices rising, disbelief turning to anger, anger turning to fear. What is this? Who did this? Where is Ashworth's painting? Thomas Ashworth stood frozen, face draining pale in real time, as if the painting had reached out and pulled the blood from him. He blinked once, twice, like a man trying to wake from a nightmare. No, he breathed. The word was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was raw, like something torn from his throat. He stepped forward. Then another step. And then he lunged, arms outstretched, hands reaching to tear the canvas from the easel. 2 men grabbed him. Friends, family acquaintances, men who had watched him grow up, and held him back hard enough to make his shoulders jerk. Thomas, stop. You cannot. Look at the governor. Thomas thrashed like a trapped animal, eyes locked on the signature. Gideon. 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 He had inspected his masterpiece 2 days ago. He had seen the Charleston founders, the ships, the gold light, the heroic faces. He had touched the edge of the frame. He had smiled. This was not that painting. And yet, every stroke, every shadow, every breath of color screamed the same hand that had made his work famous. The governor stepped back from the podium, lips parting slightly as if the words had been stolen from him. His eyes moved from the signature to Thomas, then back again, caught between outrage and terror. Because the painting did not merely expose a scandal. It suggested something worse. It suggested that a black boy, enslaved, hidden, unnamed, had created brilliance that the South had crowned on a white man's head. That was not just embarrassing. That was dangerous. The ballroom swelled with panic. Women pressed against their husbands. Men glanced toward the doors as if expecting soldiers. Someone shouted that abolitionists had done it. Someone else swore it was witchcraft. A priest muttered a prayer under his breath, making the sign of the cross as though the canvas might curse them. And in the back of the room, near the servers and shadows, a thin man with spectacles lowered his tray just slightly and watched it all unfold with a stillness that did not belong in that chaos. What they did not know was that the real storm was not inside the ballroom. It was already moving through the streets of Charleston. Because at that very moment, while the richest people in the South stared at a signature they could not erase, someone else was riding hard through the darkness toward Ashworth Plantation. And he carried one simple order. Find the boy. Bring him back. Alive if possible. By morning, the city would call it scandal. By the end of the week, they would call it treason. And before the summer ended, they would call Gideon Vance something far worse. They would call him a ghost that needed to be hunted. To understand why that name on the canvas shattered the room, you have to return to a place most of those guests had never truly seen. 14 years earlier, 43 miles northwest of Charleston, the Ashworth Plantation lay spread across nearly 3,000 acres of Carolina low country. Cotton fields rolled outward like a pale sea, broken only by drainage ditches and the dark green shadows of live oaks. Spanish moss hung from their branches like funeral cloth, swaying gently even when the air was still. In 1840, the plantation held 112 enslaved people. Cornelius Ashworth owned them all. He was a third-generation planter, tall, narrow-faced, and precise in everything he did. Cornelius did not shout. He did not rage. He did not need to. His cruelty lived in numbers, not whips. Births, deaths, purchases, sales, all recorded in the same leather ledger where he tracked cotton yields and equipment costs. Human lives entered as ink and exited as margins. In March of that year, an enslaved woman named Ruth went into labor. She was 22 years old, small-framed, quiet-spoken, purchased at 12 from a Savannah slave market and put to work wherever she was needed. Fields first, then kitchen, then laundry when her hands grew too cracked to pick cotton at speed. She labored in one of the rough cabins behind the big house, the kind built quickly and repaired only when collapse became unavoidable. The women from the quarters gathered around her, doing what they could with rags, boiled water, and knowledge passed down through generations of survival. The labor lasted nearly 18 hours. No doctor came. No overseer checked. Ruth screamed only once. Just before dawn on March 14th, a boy was born, thin but breathing. Small fists clenched tight, lungs strong enough to announce him to the world. Ruth held him for less than an hour. She named him Gideon. She chose the name from a story she had heard during Sunday services, about a man who defeated an army he was never supposed to overcome. She whispered the name against her son's skin like a promise. Then the bleeding worsened. By the time the sun rose fully over the pine trees, Ruth was dead. Her body was removed quietly. No bell rang. No marker was placed. Another line would be written in Cornelius Ashworth's ledger before breakfast. The baby was handed to Cora. Cora was already old then, well past 60. She had raised 6 children on that plantation. 4 of them had been sold south. 2 she never saw again. Her back was bent from decades of labor, her hands scarred and swollen, but when she took Gideon into her arms, something in her hardened instead of breaking. She fed him with milk soaked into cloth. She kept him warm with her own body when the nights grew cold. She slept lightly, always listening, because survival on a plantation depended on hearing danger before it arrived. Later, she would say the boy did not cry the way other babies did. He watched. His eyes followed movement too closely. Light, faces, shadows on the wall. By the time Gideon could sit upright, he would trace shapes in the dirt with his fingers. Circles, lines, patterns that meant nothing to anyone else. Cornelius Ashworth never saw the child. Gideon existed to him only as a number under Ruth's name, an asset that would grow useful in time. Gideon's father never knew he existed. His name was Solomon. Strong back, quiet man. Sold to a Mississippi plantation 2 months before Gideon was born to settle a debt. He died of fever in 1847, never knowing he had a son, never knowing that something extraordinary had been left behind. By the age of 5, Gideon was working. He carried water from the well to the fields, wooden buckets biting into his palms as he walked back and forth under the Carolina sun. He learned quickly not to spill. Spilled water meant slower work. Slower work meant attention. By 7, he was sent to the stables. He cleaned stalls, brushed horses, shoveled waste. He learned when to step aside, when to lower his eyes, when to disappear. But when night came, when the overseers returned to their quarters and the plantation settled into its uneasy quiet, Gideon found other work. Behind the old smokehouse, where weeds grew tall and no one cared to look, he found pieces of charcoal left from cooking fires. He picked them up like treasure, on scraps of wood, on flat stones, on the dirt itself. He drew. He drew faces from memory, the curve of Cora's mouth, the tired eyes of men returning from the fields, the shape of the big house, white columns rising like something unreal. He drew horses with muscles that felt alive, trees whose branches seemed to move even when still. No one taught him. No one corrected him. And somehow, without instruction, without example, his hand learned things his mind could not name. In the spring of 1848, when Gideon was 8 years old, someone saw Ezekiel. He was one of the oldest men on the plantation, his skin marked with scars from a life that began across the ocean. He had been brought from Africa as a young man, long before laws pretended to soften slavery's edges. He found Gideon behind the smokehouse one evening, crouched low, charcoal blackening his fingers. The drawing stopped Ezekiel's breath. It was a woman's face. Ruth's face. Gideon had never seen her. But Cora had described her many times. Her eyes, her smile, the small scar on her chin. Gideon had taken those words and turned them into something that looked back at Ezekiel with impossible familiarity. Ezekiel knelt slowly. "This gift," he said carefully, "will get you killed if the wrong eyes see it." Gideon looked up, afraid now. Ezekiel told him the truth most children were never told. White folks did not like black people doing what they were not meant to do. Talent was dangerous. Intelligence was dangerous. Beauty was dangerous. "Hide it," Ezekiel said. "Promise me." Gideon promised. For 3 years he kept that promise. And in that silence, his gift grew sharper. What none of them knew, not Gideon, not Cora, not even Ezekiel, was that someone else would soon see those drawings. And when that happened, the cage around Gideon's life would change shape. Not open, just tighten. In the autumn of 1850, Thomas Ashworth came home. He arrived at the plantation in a carriage dusted white from the long road, trunk strapped to the back, posture stiff with the practiced confidence of a young man who had spent 3 years being told he was exceptional. Boston had given him polish. Lectures on classical art. Galleries filled with landscapes and saints and ancient ruins. Professors who spoke of composition and proportion as if they were moral laws. But Boston had also given him something else. Doubt. Thomas had learned technique. He could mix colors correctly. He could copy a master's brushstroke well enough to impress a classroom. What he could not do, what no amount of money or instruction had given him, was the thing that could not be taught. Life. His paintings were careful. Accurate. Empty. He knew it. Worse, he knew others knew it too. Cornelius Ashworth greeted his son with approval, not affection. He inspected Thomas's hands for softness, his posture for weakness, his speech for any northern corruption. Satisfied enough, he welcomed him back into the world of cotton ledgers and inherited authority. Thomas smiled, played the role. Inside, something dark had already begun to take root. Life on the plantation continued unchanged. Bells rang. Work began before sunrise. Overseers counted bodies like tools. Gideon barely noticed Thomas's return at first. Master's sons came and went. They were storms that passed overhead, loud but distant. Until one evening in the fall of 1851. Gideon was 11. He had finished his work in the stables early and slipped behind the smokehouse as the sun sank low, staining the sky orange and purple. He found a piece of pine bark smooth enough to work on and took charcoal from his pocket. His hand moved without hesitation. He was drawing the plantation at dusk. The big house stood in the distance, white and unreal. The field stretched outward, shadows long and soft. The sky bled color in ways Gideon did not have words for, but his hand understood them anyway. He did not hear Thomas at first. Thomas heard him. The faint scratch of charcoal against bark caught his attention as he walked the edge of the property, restless, dissatisfied, searching for something he could not name. He followed the sound through weeds and brush until he saw the boy crouched low, intent, unaware. Thomas stopped. The image before him did something that no gallery in Boston ever had. It struck him. The perspective was flawless. The colors, made from crushed berries and earth, captured light in a way Thomas had spent years failing to achieve. The painting did not imitate beauty. It possessed it. Thomas felt heat rise into his face. Then something uglier. Recognition. This was real talent. And it was not his. Gideon sensed the presence and froze. He turned slowly, heart pounding, already bracing for punishment. For shouting. For blows. For being dragged before the overseer. None of that came. Thomas knelt instead. Up close the work was worse, better. Every line intentional. Every shadow alive. How long have you been doing this? Gideon swallowed. Since I was small, sir. Who taught you? No one. Thomas stared at him. He wanted to accuse the boy of lying. To demand the name of some secret teacher. But the truth sat there, undeniable, staring back from the bark. Do you know what this is worth? Thomas asked. Gideon did not answer. He did not know how. Thomas stood slowly, his mind shifting gears the way he had watched his fathers do when calculating profit. An idea formed. Dangerous. Perfect. You will not be punished, Thomas said. Not for this. Gideon's chest loosened slightly. But, Thomas continued, you will work for me now. He explained it carefully, smoothly, like a contract between equals, though only one of them had a choice. Gideon would paint, in secret, with real supplies. In exchange, Thomas would protect him. Better food, better clothes, no sale. And your little friend, Thomas added casually, eyes sharp. The girl, Mercy, she stays too. As long as you cooperate. The words were calm. The meaning was not. Gideon understood. This was not freedom. It was leverage. He agreed because he had no language for refusal. The studio was set up in the basement of the big house, a space once used for storage. Thomas brought canvases, oils, brushes imported from Europe. Books filled with reproductions of great works Gideon had never imagined existed. He absorbed them instantly. Light, shadow, anatomy, depth. Within months, Gideon painted like someone who had been waiting his entire life for permission to breathe. Thomas took the paintings and signed them. At first, he told himself it was temporary, that he would learn by watching, that the talent might rub off. But as praise poured in, something hardened inside him. People called him gifted, genius, prodigy, and Thomas let them. Visitors came. Commissions followed. Money changed hands. And Gideon remained invisible, locked away whenever guests arrived, sent to the far fields or the basement with orders not to be seen. At night, when the house slept, Gideon painted. He painted men who owned people. He painted land soaked in sweat and blood. He painted beauty built on suffering. And every time Thomas's name appeared beneath his work, something inside Gideon twisted tighter. What Thomas did not realize, what he could not see from his place above, was that talent, once awakened, does not obey cages. And that the boy he had trapped beneath the house was not merely learning how to paint. He was learning how to tell the truth. The first weeks felt almost kind. That was the most dangerous part. Gideon was moved from the stables to the basement studio permanently. He no longer rose before dawn to haul water or shovel waste. His hands, once cracked and raw, began to soften. Thomas arranged for better food to be sent down, bread that was not stale, meat more than once a week. A clean shirt appeared, then another. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like mercy. Gideon knew better. The room beneath the big house had no windows. Light came from oil lamps that smoked and hissed, staining the ceiling black. The air smelled of turpentine and damp wood. When Gideon painted, time slipped in strange ways. Hours vanished. Days folded into each other. He worked until his back ached and his eyes burned, until the images in his mind demanded release. Thomas visited often at first. He asked questions. He watched closely. Too closely. How did you decide the light should fall there? Why that color? Do it again. Slower. Gideon answered as best he could, though much of what he did came from instinct, not logic. He could not explain why a shadow needed softening or why a face required just a touch more darkness beneath the eyes. He only knew when it was wrong. Thomas grew frustrated. He tried to paint alongside Gideon, brush trembling in his hand as he attempted to mimic what he saw. The results were always the same. Flat. Lifeless. Imitation without understanding. Eventually, Thomas stopped trying. Instead, he watched Gideon like a man watching a machine that produced gold. As the months passed, Gideon's work improved at a terrifying speed. Techniques that took trained artists years to master came to him as if remembered rather than learned. He understood depth the way some people understood prayer. His figures did not merely exist on canvas, they breathed. Thomas's reputation grew with each stolen brushstroke. Visitors arrived from Charleston. Wealthy neighbors commissioned portraits. Women posed stiffly, men demanded to look dignified, powerful. Gideon painted them all, capturing truths they never asked for and never saw. Thomas accepted payment, smiled, signed his name. When guests were in the house, Gideon was not allowed upstairs. Not even to clean. He was kept below or sent away entirely. Thomas did not trust chance. The boy's existence was a flaw in the illusion. Once, a visiting merchant asked casually, "Does Ashworth do all his own work?" Thomas laughed. "Of course. Talent runs in families." Gideon heard that laughter echo through the floorboards. The threat came quietly. It always did. Mercy was 7 now, growing fast, clever and curious. Gideon taught her letters by scratching shapes into dirt behind the quarters. He shared his extra bread with her. He walked her back when older boys grew rough. Thomas noticed. One evening, as Gideon cleaned his brushes, Thomas leaned against the doorway. "She is not yours," he said lightly. Gideon did not look up. "She could be sold," Thomas continued. "Girls fetch a good price, especially pretty ones." Gideon's hand stilled. "As long as you remember who protects you," Thomas added, "she remains here." The message was clear. Paint or lose her. From that moment, every canvas felt heavier. Every stroke carried fear. Gideon painted faster, harder, pouring his rage into color and line. The art grew stronger because of it. Thomas mistook that strength for loyalty. By 1853, Thomas Ashworth was celebrated across South Carolina. Critics praised his natural genius. Newspapers printed his name beside words like brilliance and promise. Invitations arrived from galleries. A major commission came from the governor himself, a grand historical piece meant to honor Charleston's founding. It was to be unveiled in June of 1854. Thomas announced the news at dinner, voice proud, already rehearsing acceptance speeches. Gideon stood in the basement that night staring at a blank canvas. The commission was different. This painting would be seen by everyone who mattered. Politicians, editors, men who decided what was remembered and what was erased. Thomas paced the studio as he described what he wanted. Heroic figures. Ships in the harbor. Light breaking through clouds like divine approval. Gideon listened, and for the first time in years he did not lower his eyes. Something inside him shifted. The lie had grown too large. What Thomas did not know, what he could not feel from his place above, was that Gideon had been thinking for a long time. In the quiet hours after midnight, in the space between fear and sleep, he had learned patience on the plantation, learned how to survive without being seen, learned how systems worked, how power hid itself behind smiles and paper and signatures. He understood now that escape alone would not be enough. If he ran, Thomas would keep the paintings, keep the praise, keep the lie alive. The truth would remain buried in a basement. Gideon picked up his brush. He began the governor's painting exactly as ordered. But in his mind, another image was already taking shape. One Thomas had never asked for. One Thomas would never approve. One that carried fire. And somewhere beyond the plantation, unknown to Thomas, unknown even to Gideon himself yet, a man was already traveling south, asking questions no one wanted answered. Ezra Finch arrived at the Ashworth plantation in April of 1854 with a wagon full of art supplies and a smile that made people underestimate him. He was thin, slightly stooped, spectacles perched low on his nose, dressed like a man who made his living politely inconveniencing others. He introduced himself as a traveling salesman, specializing in brushes, pigments, canvas, and imported oils. His voice was mild, his manners impeccable. He carried letters of introduction from Charleston merchants who trusted him. Cornelius Ashworth would have dismissed him outright if not for one thing. Thomas Ashworth's name. Ezra mentioned it casually as if by accident. Spoke of admiration. Of how even in Philadelphia and Boston, people were talking about the young Southern painter whose work seemed far beyond his years. Cornelius stiffened with pride. Thomas was summoned. The two men spoke at length in the parlor, Thomas animated, Ezra attentive. They discussed technique, composition, European schools of thought. Ezra asked questions that sounded harmless but were anything but. How long do you spend on a piece like that? Do you sketch extensively beforehand? Do you work mornings or evenings? Thomas answered smoothly, but Ezra noticed what his words avoided. There were no specifics, no habits, no rituals, no talk of failures or discarded drafts. That evening, Ezra dined with the family. He watched hands as much as faces. Thomas's hands were clean. Too clean. No stains beneath the fingernails. No faint traces of pigment in the creases of skin where paint always found its way, no matter how careful the artist. Ezra had sold supplies to painters for over a decade. He knew the marks the work left behind. After dinner, Ezra excused himself early, claiming a headache. He waited until the house settled, footsteps thinning, lamps dimming. Then he moved. He followed instinct more than plan, slipping down service corridors, pausing when voices passed overhead. He noticed a locked door near the back stairwell, its handle worn smooth from frequent use. Light leaked faintly from beneath it. Ezra opened the door. The basement studio breathed back at him. Oil lamps flickered. Canvases lined the walls, stacked and leaning. The air was thick with turpentine and something else. Concentration, maybe, or despair. At the center of the room stood a boy. Gideon turned, eyes wide, terror blooming instantly. The brush fell from his hand and clattered to the floor. Ezra raised both palms slowly. "I am not here to hurt you." Gideon did not move. Years of warning held him rigid. Ezra's eyes moved to the canvas. He felt his chest tighten. The painting was alive. Light moved across it in a way that made the room feel smaller, less real. Ezra knew what he was looking at the moment he saw it. "Truth. Did you paint this?" Ezra asked softly. Silence. Then barely audible, "Yes." Ezra sat on a crate without asking permission. He did not rush. He did not crowd. He waited. The story came out in fragments at first. The smokehouse. The charcoal. Thomas's discovery. The bargain. The threats. When Gideon spoke of mercy, his voice broke. Ezra listened until the lamps burned low. When Gideon finished, the room felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were ashamed. "You know," Ezra said carefully, "that what he has done is theft." Gideon nodded. "He owns me." Ezra shook his head. "He owns nothing of what you make." That was the first time Gideon had ever heard those words spoken aloud. Ezra told him then who he really was. About the people in the North who worked quietly, patiently, helping others disappear into freedom. About safe houses, coded letters, routes mapped by faith and desperation. "I can help you leave," Ezra said. "You and the girl." Gideon looked at the canvas. If he left now, the painting stayed. The lie stayed. Thomas Ashworth would remain celebrated. Gideon would become a rumor. "No," Gideon said finally. Ezra frowned. "You would stay." "I would finish," Gideon replied. But not his way. And in that moment the plan was born. They spoke until dawn. Of the governor's commission. Of the unveiling in Charleston. Of how a single moment, witnessed by the right eyes, could fracture a lie that had been carefully polished for years. Gideon would paint what Thomas expected. And something else. Ezra would make arrangements. The following weeks passed under a strange calm. Thomas grew distant, distracted by social obligations and interviews. He trusted Gideon completely now. Too completely. That trust would destroy him. Gideon worked by day on the governor's canvas, careful, obedient, perfect. By night he worked on another. This painting was not beautiful. It was honest. He painted himself as he had never dared before. He painted fire. He painted faces hidden in shadow. He painted a brush raised not in service but in defiance. He signed it with his name. Gideon. Outside, Charleston prepared for celebration. Inside the basement, history prepared to break. What none of them knew, not Thomas, not Cornelius, not the men polishing their speeches, was that the truth had already been packed, rolled tight, waiting to be carried into the heart of their world. And when it arrived, there would be no curtain thick enough to hide it. By May, the plantation moved to a rhythm that felt rehearsed. Thomas Ashworth rarely came to the basement now. He had stopped watching Gideon paint the way a man stops watching a lock once he believes the door is secure. Social calls filled his days. Letters arrived daily, requests for interviews, invitations to dinners, inquiries about future commissions. His name traveled faster than he did. Gideon noticed the change immediately. Neglect was a gift. The governor's painting grew under Gideon's hand exactly as Thomas had ordered. Ships in the harbor. Founders standing tall, gazing toward destiny. light breaking through clouds as if heaven itself approved of what followed. Gideon rendered every figure with reverence he did not feel and precision he could not deny. Thomas inspected it twice in May. Each time he smiled. "Magnificent," he said, voice thick with relief. "This will silence every critic." Gideon said nothing. He lowered his eyes. He dipped his brush. And when Thomas left, Gideon waited until the house fell asleep. The second painting lived behind the first, hidden by cloth and careful positioning. Gideon worked on it only when he was certain no one watched. Ezra Finch had smuggled him a small mirror, cracked at the corner, just large enough to reflect a face. Gideon studied himself. Not the way overseers saw him. Not the way Thomas saw him. But the way he felt when he painted. He painted the strength he had been told did not exist. The anger he had been forced to swallow. The clarity that came from years of watching men lie with confidence. Behind him the plantation burned. He hid faces in the smoke, Cora's lined eyes. Ezekiel's quiet warning. Ruth as she might have looked had she lived. Mercy, small and frightened but still standing. The signature came last. Gideon. One word. One truth. Ezra returned briefly in early June, disguised as a supplier delivering additional oils for the masterpiece. They spoke only minutes, but the plan was complete. A free black wagon driver named Samuel would be in Charleston the night of the unveiling. Mercy would be taken from the plantation quietly. Gideon would follow. If something goes wrong, Ezra said, run. Do not look back. Gideon nodded. He had already decided. On June 15th, Thomas came down for a final inspection. He pulled the cloth from the large canvas and leaned close, breath held like a prayer. It was perfect. He clapped Gideon on the shoulder, a gesture meant to feel generous. This, he said, will be remembered. Gideon watched him go, listening to his footsteps fade overhead. That night, Gideon did not sleep. He wrapped the second painting carefully, rolling it tight, protecting it like a living thing. Before dawn, he slipped from the studio and made his way to the quarters. Mercy waited, eyes wide but dry. She trusted Gideon the way children trust gravity. They left before sunrise. By the time the painting reached Charleston under guard, Gideon and Mercy were already miles away, hidden beneath canvas and straw in Samuel's wagon. The road north was long and dangerous. Patrols passed twice. Once, a deputy peered into the wagon, hand on his pistol, suspicious of nothing he could name. Samuel talked. Calm, friendly, unremarkable. They reached Charleston after dusk. The city glowed. Lanterns lined Meeting Street. Music spilled from the Planters Hotel. Carriages crowded the block. Power gathered in one place, drunk on itself. Ezra Finch moved through the ballroom in a server's uniform, tray balanced perfectly, heart steady. He waited. At 8 o'clock the curtain fell, and the truth walked into the light. From the street, Gideon heard the roar. It was not applause. It was not celebration. It was shock. He did not stop. He did not look back. By the time Thomas realized the boy was gone, Gideon and Mercy were already on the road north. The painting's image burned into the minds of men who would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget it. In Charleston, chaos took shape. Thomas was dragged from the room, furious, pale, shouting lies that convinced no one. The governor ordered calm. Reporters vanished into the night, ink already drying in their heads. By dawn, headlines would spread. By week's end, records would disappear. By year's end, Gideon Vance would become a rumor. But rumors are dangerous things, especially when they are true. And somewhere on a dark road beyond the reach of lanterns and lies, a boy who had never owned his own name finally carried it with him into the night. Charleston woke the next morning with a new kind of hunger. Not the hunger for oysters and champagne, not the soft appetite of polite society. This was sharper, meaner. The hunger of a city that had been embarrassed in public and needed someone to punish for it. The Charleston Mercury hit the streets before sunrise. Boys shouted headlines at corners, their voices echoing between brick buildings and iron balconies. Ashworth scandal shocks governor's gala. Mysterious Negro signature found on masterwork. Men read it in barber chairs. Women read it behind curtains. Planters read it in parlors with coffee going cold in their hands. And the same question spread through the city like smoke. Who was Gideon? In the Planters' hotel, the ballroom had been scrubbed clean as if cleanliness could erase witness. The shattered glass had been swept away. The curtain rehung. The chandeliers still glittered. But the air felt different now, like a room where something died. Thomas Ashworth sat in a private suite on the second floor, hands shaking so badly he could not hold a cup. He had not slept. His face looked too young suddenly, stripped of confidence. His eyes kept returning to the same invisible corner. The signature. Gideon. He replayed the moment the curtain fell again and again, hearing the silence, the gasp, the rising roar. He could still see the governor's expression, confusion turning to alarm. He could still feel the hands gripping his arms when he tried to tear the painting down. Not because he cared about destroying art, because he cared about destroying proof. Cornelius Ashworth arrived by noon. He did not storm in shouting. That was not Cornelius's way. He entered the suite with slow, measured steps, his coat still dusty from the road, his hat in his hand, his face composed so tightly it looked carved. Thomas started speaking the moment he saw him, words spilling out like blood from a wound. They switched it. Someone switched it. It was not, Father, I inspected. Cornelius raised one hand. Silence fell. How long, Cornelius asked, voice quiet, has this been happening? Thomas blinked. What? Cornelius's eyes narrowed. Do not insult me with performance. The words hit Thomas harder than a slap. In the silence that followed, Thomas's shoulders collapsed a fraction. The truth, once trapped, came out in ugly fragments. A boy. A studio. Paintings made underground. Names signed above stolen work. Cornelius listened without interruption, his expression barely changing. Only once, when Thomas mentioned the threats used to control the boy, did Cornelius's jaw tighten. When Thomas finished, Cornelius exhaled slowly. Not in shock. In calculation. This is not merely a family matter now, Cornelius said. This is political. Thomas's eyes darted. Father, I can explain. You cannot explain genius with no record, Cornelius replied. You cannot explain the name on that canvas. You cannot explain why your hands are clean. Thomas flinched. Cornelius stepped closer. Where is the boy? Thomas swallowed. He should be at the plantation. Cornelius turned to the door. Then we find him. Orders went out like signals from a fortress. A rider was sent back to the plantation immediately, Thomas's servant James, spurring his horse hard through heat and dust. Another messenger went to the city patrol captain. Another to a private investigator known for recovering property. And quietly, a note went to the governor's office offering cooperation and requesting discretion. Cornelius understood the rules of power. If the story became truth, it would spread. If it spread, it would rot the foundation. So it had to become a lie. By late afternoon, the first lie was already being rehearsed in drawing rooms and offices. A northern hoax. An abolitionist trick. A switched painting, smuggled in by radicals to humiliate South Carolina. The governor's aides repeated it. Thomas's acquaintances nodded eagerly. Newspapers sympathetic to the planter class printed it as fact before any investigation began. But the problem with lies was that they required everyone to cooperate. And not everyone did. There were 3 reporters at the gala. One of them, young, ambitious, eager, had watched Thomas Ashworth's face too closely to believe the hoax explanation. That night, he stayed up in the Mercury office, writing with ink-stained fingers and eyes bright with opportunity. He described the painting's technique, the unmistakable continuity between Ashworth's previous work and this new scandalous canvas, the panic in the room. And he asked one forbidden question. If the hand behind the brush was not Thomas's, whose was it? By dawn the next day, other newspapers were requesting copies. Telegraph lines carried shortened versions north. Richmond, Savannah, New Orleans, then Philadelphia, Boston, New York. In the Ashworth suite, Thomas paced, breath shallow. What if they come for me? He asked, voice breaking into something almost childish. What if they ruin me? Cornelius looked at him coldly. They will ruin you if you panic. Thomas stopped pacing. Then what do we do? Cornelius's answer was simple. We make the boy disappear. Thomas's eyes widened. Father. Cornelius raised his hand again. You do not understand. If Gideon is found and questioned, if he speaks, it is not your name that burns. It is the system. Do you think men will let that happen? Thomas swallowed. His throat clicked. Cornelius leaned closer, voice lower. You will not be the only one hunting him. That was the moment Thomas finally understood. This was bigger than pride. Bigger than art. Bigger than a stolen signature. A black boy had shown proof of mastery. Proof of mind. Proof of humanity stamped into paint. If that proof stood unchallenged, it would be used like a knife. So men with power would turn the entire South into a net. James reached the plantation just before dawn on June 19th. He found panic waiting. Gideon's sleeping pallet was untouched. Mercy's too. Cora refused to meet James's eyes. Ezekiel was suddenly nowhere to be found. The quarters were quiet in that eerie way that meant everyone knew something but no one was foolish enough to speak. James rode back to Charleston with his horse foaming and his fear rising with every mile. By the time he burst into Cornelius's presence, his words came out breathless. He is gone, sir. The boy is gone. The girl too. Thomas went pale. Cornelius did not. He simply nodded once as if confirming what he already suspected. Then he turned to the investigator and said, "Post the reward." By noon, printed notices were nailed to posts and tavern doors across 3 counties. Runaway Negro boy, name, Gideon, age, 17. Valuable. Reward, $300 alive. $300 was more than most men earned in a year. It was not a reward. It was a declaration. And somewhere north of Charleston, hidden beneath rough canvas in a wagon that moved only when roads were clear, Gideon held Mercy close and listened to the distant world waking behind them. He did not know the exact amount on his head yet. He did not know how many men would be hunting him. But he could feel it, like thunder behind a horizon. What none of them knew was that the storm would not end with capture. Because the truth Gideon had unleashed in that ballroom did not stay in Charleston. It traveled. And every mile it traveled, it grew harder to bury. The wagon moved only when the world felt empty. Samuel knew the rhythm of danger the way sailors knew tides. He traveled at night when patrols grew lazy and stopped before dawn when questions came easier to men with badges and guns. The horses were trained not to startle. The wheels were wrapped to quiet their song against the road. Beneath the canvas, Gideon counted miles by sound. Crickets, frogs, wind in the trees, the occasional creak of leather when Samuel shifted on the bench. Each noise told him whether they were alone or being watched. Mercy slept in fits, her small body tucked against his side. When she stirred, Gideon whispered stories, not of freedom yet, not of danger, but of colors and shapes, of places where rivers bent like silver ribbons and skies opened wide enough to breathe. On the 3rd night they heard dogs. The sound came faint at first, carried on warm air, short, sharp barks, purposeful. Samuel slowed the wagon without a word and steered off the road into a stand of pines. He killed the lantern. Darkness swallowed them whole. Gideon pressed Mercy's face into his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, fast and fluttering like a trapped bird. He wrapped one hand over her mouth, not hard, just enough to remind her to be still. The dogs grew louder. A man's voice followed. Then another. Samuel slid down from the bench and disappeared into the trees. Gideon's pulse roared in his ears. He imagined hands grabbing canvas, boots thudding close, a face peering in. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that the dogs were chasing a different scent entirely, another desperate soul who had fled a mile west, drawing the hunt away like a sacrifice. The barking faded. Samuel returned after what felt like an hour but was barely 10 minutes. He did not smile. He simply nodded and climbed back onto the bench. They did not speak again until dawn. At a safe house outside Columbia, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes sharp as knives fed them cornbread and milk. She asked no questions. She had learned long ago that answers got people killed. Gideon washed his hands in a basin and watched dark water swirl down the drain. Paint had stained his fingers so long he half expected it never to leave. When the charcoal finally rinsed away, his hands looked smaller somehow. Younger. That frightened him more than the dogs had. By the end of the first week, the news had outrun them. In taverns and markets, Gideon heard his name spoken by strangers. Sometimes with curiosity. Sometimes with anger. Sometimes with disbelief. "Can't be true," a man scoffed outside a feed store. "A Negro can't paint like that." Another replied, "Then explain the canvas." They kept moving. Every safe house brought new warnings. Notices posted farther north. Rewards increased. Stories twisted. Some said Gideon was a tool of abolitionists. Others claimed he was a fraud invented to shame the South. A few whispered something more dangerous, that if a slave could paint like a master, what else had been stolen? Gideon listened but did not speak. At night, when Mercy slept, he replayed the ballroom in his mind though he had never seen it. He imagined the faces when the curtain fell. He imagined Thomas's expression. Not satisfaction. Not pride. Fear. That image steadied him when exhaustion threatened to drag him under. They crossed into North Carolina under rain so heavy it blurred the world into gray. Samuel covered the wagon and pushed the horses harder, trusting the storm to wash their tracks away. The roads turned to mud. Progress slowed. At a farmhouse near the border, a Quaker man opened his door without being asked. "You're expected," he said simply. Inside, Gideon was handed a pencil. The man had heard the story. He wanted proof, not for newspapers, not for politics, but for himself. Gideon hesitated only a moment. He drew Mercy first, then the road, then a face from memory, lines soft but unyielding. The man watched in silence, breath shallow, until the image emerged complete. When Gideon finished, the man folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer. "They can hunt you," he said, "but they cannot unsee this." The closer they came to Pennsylvania, the more Gideon felt the tension in his body loosen. Not disappear. Loosen. Like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long. On the 15th day, Samuel stopped the wagon at a sign Gideon could not read but somehow understood. "Free soil." Mercy laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Gideon did not. He waited for the trap. For the hand that always came next. It did not. They traveled on to Philadelphia in daylight. Ezra Finch waited near the edge of the city, hat pulled low, relief visible even before he spoke. He embraced Gideon once, briefly, then knelt to Mercy's level. "You're safe," he told her. The words sounded fragile, like glass. The Morrison house in Germantown smelled of soap and fresh bread. Sarah Morrison wrapped Mercy in a shawl and spoke softly as if the girl might shatter. Jacob Morrison showed Gideon the attic, where light poured through a single window like a promise. "This can be your studio," Jacob said. Gideon stood very still. That night, Gideon slept in a bed with clean sheets. He woke before dawn, heart racing, certain he had overslept and missed work. For a moment, panic seized him. Then he remembered. No bell. No overseer. No ledger. He sat up slowly, hands trembling, and began to cry without sound. Back in Charleston, the hunt faltered. The trail grew cold. Witnesses contradicted each other. Samuel vanished into the city's shifting population. The investigator reported nothing concrete. The reward doubled, then tripled. Cornelius Ashworth read the updates with increasing frustration. The boy had slipped the net. And worse, the story would not die. In northern papers, Gideon became a symbol. In southern ones, a problem. Thomas watched his name rot in print, watched galleries hesitate, watched friends avoid his eyes. He tried to paint again. The canvas remained dead. He stared at it for hours, brush hovering, hand shaking, until finally he hurled it against the wall. Nothing came. The truth had left him, and it was not coming back. Meanwhile, in a quiet attic in Philadelphia, Gideon dipped a brush into fresh paint and made his first stroke in freedom. He signed his name at the bottom before the image was even complete. Just to see it there. Just to remind himself it was real. What none of them knew, what history would take years to catch up to, was that this was not the end of Gideon Vance's story. It was the beginning of his voice, and it would grow louder. Philadelphia did not feel like freedom at first. It felt like standing in a wide open place after a lifetime underground. Too much air, too much sky, the ground uncertain beneath every step. Gideon learned quickly that freedom did not erase fear. It changed its shape. In the South, fear wore boots and carried ledgers. In the North, it arrived quietly, disguised as law. The Fugitive Slave Act still breathed. Ezra explained it carefully. Marshals, bounties, courts that could turn a free street into a cage in a single afternoon. Cornelius Ashworth's claim remained on paper, and paper was powerful. So Gideon stayed careful. He worked at Jacob Morrison's print shop during the day, setting type, carving woodcuts, cleaning ink from rollers. The work was honest and paid in coins Gideon held and counted more than once, just to feel their weight. At night, he climbed the attic stairs and painted. The light there was different. Northern light fell sharper, clearer. It showed mistakes quickly and rewarded patience. Gideon painted landscapes first. Rivers that curved without fences, streets where black men walked unbowed, skies without smoke. He painted Mercy laughing, her hair braided neatly for school, slate tucked under her arm. He painted faces he remembered from the quarters, not as they had been forced to appear, but as he knew them to be. Ezra brought visitors quietly. Abolitionists, artists, Quakers with careful eyes and steady hands. They stood in the attic and said very little at first. Then they began to argue about what to do with him. Some wanted him hidden, protected, a treasure too fragile to risk. Others wanted him seen, immediately, loudly, proof made flesh. Gideon listened. He did not interrupt. He had learned on the plantation that men often spoke longest when they were least certain. In the South, the response hardened. Southern newspapers mocked the story now, calling it Northern propaganda. Editors wrote with forced confidence, insisting the painting was a forgery, a staged insult to Southern honor. Thomas Ashworth's name appeared less frequently, then only in dismissive footnotes. But among planters, fear traveled faster than ridicule. They remembered the canvas, the eyes, the signature. They remembered how it felt to be seen. Investigations continued quietly. A report was written. Witnesses interviewed. Cora spoke, voice steady despite the danger. She told everything. She did not cry. She did not ask for mercy. When the report reached the governor's desk, it stayed there, locked away. Because to acknowledge Gideon was to acknowledge theft, not just of labor but of mind. And that acknowledgement would crack something open that could not be closed again. Thomas Ashworth tried to recover. He painted, failed, painted again, failed harder. He drank. Friends stopped calling. Invitations dried up. He submitted work under false names and received polite rejections that felt worse than public scorn. He had built himself on a stolen foundation, and once the truth cracked it, nothing stood. In 1856, he left for Europe. No farewell. No announcement. Just disappearance. Cornelius Ashworth salvaged what he could: donations, political favors, silence purchased carefully. When he died in 1861, obituaries praised his business sense and avoided mention of art entirely. In the North, Gideon's story continued to move. Frederick Douglass referenced it once in a speech in Boston, his voice calm, devastating. "They tell us we are incapable," he said. "Then they steal our genius and wear it like a crown." The words reached Philadelphia within days. Gideon read them twice. In 1857, a letter arrived from Boston, heavy with intention. An exhibition was being planned. The Art of Freedom. A gathering of black artists, free and formerly enslaved, meant to show what had been denied and what had survived. The organizers wanted Gideon's work. They wanted Gideon. Ezra explained the risk. Public exposure meant protection and danger in equal measure. Lawyers would be hired. Support rallied. But the Fugitive Slave Act still loomed. Gideon asked one question. "Will the paintings be signed?" "Yes." "Then I will go." In October of 1857, Gideon Vance walked into the Boston Athenaeum wearing a suit that did not belong to any master. He was 20 years old, tall, serious. His hands bore paint stains he no longer tried to hide. 12 of his paintings hung on the walls, all signed. Visitors fell silent before them. Critics wrote with a mixture of awe and discomfort. The skill was undeniable. The story behind it impossible to ignore. Gideon spoke when asked, plainly, without bitterness. He told the truth and let it stand. No one came to claim him. Cornelius Ashworth was dead. His estate fractured. No heir wanted to test northern courts in a case that would draw crowds and headlines. Gideon was free in fact as well as law. He returned to Philadelphia and began teaching. The school was small at first. One rented room, borrowed chairs, donated supplies. Children came curious, cautious, brilliant in ways no one had bothered to look for before. Gideon taught them to see before they painted, to trust their eyes, to understand that art was not decoration. It was witness. The war came in 1861. Gideon watched it with the steady dread of someone who knew exactly what violence cost. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, he painted again. Not victory, not celebration, but faces lifted toward words written in light, hope edged with fear. When the war ended, Gideon returned south once more. The Ashworth plantation lay in ruin. The big house burned. Fields reclaimed by weeds. The quarters empty. In a small burial ground, Gideon found his mother's unmarked grave. He knelt. He wept. He placed a small painting there, Ruth as he imagined her now, wings rising from her shoulders, sky wide and star-filled. "You gave me these hands," he whispered. "I painted freedom." He returned north and lived. He painted thousands of canvases, taught hundreds of students, married, raised children, built something that could not be sold away. When he died in 1905, the paper called him one of the great American artists of the century. They did not mention the basement. They did not mention the chains. But the truth did not need them to. It was already signed. And it refused always to disappear. In the years after the war, Gideon learned something he had never been taught on the plantation. Time behaves differently when it belongs to you. There was no bell to mark the hours now, no overseer to measure the day by what it produced for someone else. Days unfolded according to light and intention. Gideon rose early because he wanted to. He worked late because the work asked him to. When exhaustion came, it was honest. When rest came, it did not carry guilt. The school in Philadelphia grew quietly. At first, it was just a room with peeling paint and borrowed easels. Then another room. Then a second floor. Parents came hesitantly, children in tow, carrying the weight of generations that had been told not to expect much. Gideon greeted them all the same way, calm, steady, unremarkable in his kindness. He did not promise greatness. He promised attention. "Look longer," he told the children. "Do not rush what the eye has not finished seeing. Your hand will follow if you let it." Some students had talent. Some did not. That never bothered him. He taught them anyway, because he knew something the world had never taught him, that worth did not begin with brilliance. Mercy became the school's quiet center. She grew into a young woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. Numbers made sense to her the way light made sense to Gideon. She kept the books, corrected mistakes without shaming, and made certain every child was fed before worrying about ink or paper. "You saved me," she told Gideon once late at night as they locked the doors. Gideon shook his head. "We saved each other." The past did not disappear. Sometimes Gideon woke from dreams where the basement ceiling pressed low and the smell of turpentine turned sour. Sometimes he found himself pausing at the sound of boots on cobblestone, heart quickening before reason intervened. Freedom did not erase memory. It gave it room. In 1870, Gideon married Elizabeth, a teacher who had joined the school during its second year. She understood his silences. She never asked him to be less than he was. They built a life measured not by spectacle, but by steadiness. They had children. Gideon painted their faces not as symbols, not as statements, but simply as they were, tired, curious, laughing, angry, alive. His work traveled farther than he ever did. Museums acquired pieces. Critics argued over style and influence. Some insisted his early genius must have been guided. Others claimed exaggeration, myth, legend layered over skill. Gideon never corrected them. He had learned long ago that truth did not need permission. In Charleston, the Planters' Hotel remained. Guests danced where the curtain had fallen. New chandeliers replaced the old. But among certain families, certain conversations stopped abruptly when art was mentioned. No one said Gideon's name aloud there anymore. They did not need to. The silence did the work for them. Thomas Ashworth died far from home, in a town that did not know his story and did not care. His paintings, those he had truly made, were found rolled and cracked in an attic after his death. They were sold cheaply, then forgotten. No one signed them. Cornelius Ashworth's ledger survived the war, pages intact, names recorded neatly. Historians would later read it as evidence of efficiency, of order, of a system that ran as designed. Gideon never saw it. He did not need to. He had lived the margins. In 1905, when Gideon's hands finally failed him, when age turned precision into effort, he wrote instead. Not memoir, not accusation, just fragments. Thoughts gathered late at night when the house slept. One page survived, folded and refolded, read at his funeral by his eldest son. They took everything from me, Gideon had written. They took my mother and my father. They took my childhood. They took my work and put another man's name on it. They tried to take my soul. But there was one thing they could never take. They could never take the truth of who I was. They could never take the vision in my eyes or the skill in my hands. They could never take the fire that burned inside me. I was a slave for 17 years. But I was an artist from the moment I was born. The people who listened that day did not clap. They sat very still. Because they understood something then. Something Charleston had tried and failed to destroy decades earlier. Power can steal labor. It can steal credit. It can steal years. But it cannot steal creation once it has been made visible. Gideon Vance's revenge had not been violence. It had not been destruction. It had not been death. It had been survival. Creation. Truth. The Ashworth plantation collapsed into weeds and memory. The system that had needed Gideon silent burned itself down in war and blood. The names that once filled ballrooms faded. But the signature remained. Painted clearly. Claimed openly. Impossible to erase. And that, more than any weapon, more than any law, was the last thing they could not take. Long after Gideon Vance was buried, long after the men who hunted him turned to dust themselves, the story kept moving. Not as a headline. Not as a scandal, but as something quieter and far more dangerous. In classrooms where no one spoke the Ashworth name anymore, teachers held up reproductions of Gideon's work and asked students to look closely, not just at the technique but at the eyes, at the way the figures seemed aware they were being watched, at the way light fell not as decoration but as testimony. Historians argued about him. Some insisted the story had grown too neat over time, too symbolic. They questioned dates, questioned witnesses, questioned whether a boy raised in bondage could truly have developed such mastery without guidance. Others answered with a simpler truth. The paintings existed. They were real. They were signed. And no one had ever been able to explain them away. In Charleston, the Planters' Hotel was renovated twice more before the century turned. Guests danced under new chandeliers, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, that the most honest moment in the building's history had lasted less than a minute and destroyed a lie generations old. No plaque marked it. No tour mentioned it. But sometimes when the light hit the ballroom just right, people reported feeling uneasy without knowing why. As if the walls remembered something the guests did not. In Philadelphia, Gideon's school outlived him. It changed names, changed addresses, expanded, contracted, but it never closed. Students who passed through its doors went on to paint, to teach, to build lives that would have been impossible a century earlier. Many never knew the full story of the man who founded it. They did not need to. They lived the proof. Mercy lived long enough to see her own students graduate. When asked once why she never married, she smiled and said she already had a family. When asked about Gideon, she paused, then answered simply, "He kept his promise." Gideon's work traveled farther than his body ever had. Museums and cities he never visited displayed his paintings under clean lights and careful labels. Viewers stood in silence before them, sensing, without being told, that these were not merely works of skill. They were acts of resistance. Because art, when it is true, does something no chain can prevent. Remembers? The South that had tried to erase Gideon eventually erased itself. The system that insisted some minds were smaller than others collapsed under the weight of its own lies. But Gideon's signature, once painted in defiance before the most powerful men in the region, remained legible long after their names lost meaning. That was the part no one could undo. Not the scandal. Not the escape. Not even the genius. The truth. Gideon had understood something very young, something most men never learned even in freedom. That identity is not what is written about you in ledgers. Not what is claimed by someone with power. Not what history tries to smooth over. Identity is what you make visible when it matters most. They tried to own him. They tried to silence him. They tried to take his gift and bury his name. Instead, he signed it. And in doing so, he outlived them all. What do you think of Gideon Vance's story? Was his greatest act of defiance the escape, or the painting itself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes history should be remembered honestly. These stories were meant to be forgotten. These voices were meant to disappear. But as long as we keep telling them, they never will. See you in the next story.